Hi everyone, thanks for watching. This is the first of 3 different videos you'll need to watch over the next 2 weeks, 2 this week, about the 3 major perspectives we find in sociology. And the first one we're going to look at today, and this follows the reading you had earlier, is the functionalist perspective. So we'll try to expand on your reading a little bit, put it into a little more, give it a little more clarity for you. All right, so the functionalist perspective, again, it focuses on the structure of society, or structures of society, because there's a lot of different structures that are going on. And it has this idea that all of these things are interrelated parts, and how do all these parts make a working system, all right? And it implies that each aspect, each working part has some sort of purpose or function that things are meant to serve, okay? So school is meant to serve a function. Hospitals are meant to serve a function. The police force is meant to serve a function. The family is meant to serve a function. So looking at how these things function or don't function is the cornerstone of the functionalist perspective. And the other cornerstone is this idea of consensus. Okay, and consensus means a general agreement, right? Not necessarily, well, you know, majority agreement, a general agreement. And functionalist sociologists, they propose that the society is held together by this agreement. Okay? Most people in society agree on what works, and they work together to make it run smoothly. It's a harmonious approach to sharing a space, if you will. Okay? Going back to this idea of functions, what is the function of a family? What is the function of religion? What is the function of education? Those are the kind of questions that a functional perspective sociologist would ask. Everything, though, doesn't always work the way it's supposed to, does it? Okay? And that's where we're going to look at something we call dysfunction, which is a term you've probably heard before. There's plenty of examples. Crime. Crime is an example of a dysfunction. Okay? If law and order is the function that most people agree to, then crime would need to be considered a dysfunction. Even in terms of something like traffic jams, okay, is a dysfunctional element of a system. Okay? If the system was working properly and all parts were working properly, we wouldn't have traffic jams. Homelessness. Okay? If the society is working the way it should, then everyone should have a home and a roof over their heads, and we wouldn't have people who lived on the streets or who needed to beg for money. So homelessness is another example of a dysfunction in society, according to functional perspective sociologists. Another possibility could be divorce. Okay? A divorced family would be considered dysfunctional in this sort of view, if the function of a family is to stay together and all these things. Clearly, if the family breaks up, it is not functioning as a family. So divorce is considered a dysfunction as well. There's lots of them, okay? But dysfunctions are really interesting to study because they can lead to social change. If a certain element of society becomes dysfunctional widely, or very commonly becomes dysfunctional, that can even lead to acceptance or normalization, okay? Society also makes interesting adjustments, both legally, morally, all sorts of ways to learn to deal with dysfunction. Okay? So dysfunction on its own leads to lots of interesting changes in society. Functions and dysfunctions come generally in two types that functionalists study. Okay? One is called a manifest function, and the other is called a latent function. Okay? And we'll go through them here. A manifest function is what is the intended and recognized outcome or purpose, right, of the element. Okay? Here's an example. Social media, right? Facebook, Twitter, you name it. Its manifest function is to connect people quickly across long distances. That's the stated function of social media. A factory, the stated function, the manifest function is to produce goods for sale or trade. Okay? And we can see that. But we can also see that those things provide other functions, don't they? And those other functions that may not have been intended, that are sort of offshoots of the main function, we call them latent functions. Okay? So they're unintended. And they're not necessarily negative. We often pull out negative side effects, we might call them. You know, a latent function is similar to a side effect, unintended consequences of something, but they're not always negative. For example, in social media, so we said the stated function, the manifest function, okay, was to connect people, but there are latent functions as well. Social media provides large audiences for marketing and advertising. It's also, social media is useful for promoting social change. Think of that ice bucket campaign for ALS that just happened in the last few months. Going back to the factory example, the factory's manifest function, we said, was to produce goods for sale or trade, but it has many latent functions as well that are positive. Employing a sizable workforce is a latent function of a factory. Boosting a town's economy, growing its tax base, all those things are latent functions of a factory. A latent dysfunction of a factory might be pollution. Okay, so you can have latent functions and you can have latent dysfunctions. Okay, as well as you can have manifest functions that are functions or dysfunctions. So you're going to hear those terms a lot: manifest function, manifest dysfunction, and latent function and latent dysfunction. So I think we've gone through that a bit. I think you get the idea of the functionalist perspective, and thanks very much for tuning in today.